Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Impact Ranking 2024 Masterclass. I'm James Pritchard, the co-host for this webinar, and I'm also very pleased to be joined by my colleague Duncan Ross, who will be taking this masterclass. To let you know, there will be a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature during the presentation, and we will answer as many of your questions at the end of the session. We will be sending out an email in the next few days, along with the recording of this session, along with the slides as well. I've seen the slides for today, and I know there's a lot to get through. So Duncan, I'm going to hand across to you.
Thank you very much, James. And just as a reminder, please do ask questions as we go along using the Q&A function. We have an hour and a half set aside for the masterclass, and I will try and leave roughly 30 minutes at the end to answer your queries. Any queries we don't manage to get to in the Q&A session, we will take those away and produce a set of written answers covering all 4 masterclasses within the next 2 weeks. But once more, welcome from the United Kingdom. Good morning to you, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Duncan Ross. I am the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. And in today's Impact Rankings 2024 Masterclass, I'm going to be looking at why the rankings exist and why your university should participate. And then I'm going to look at how you can participate, what you need to do, and what kind of data and evidence we would like to see when you enter the rankings. So for those of you who are less familiar with Times Higher Education, we've been in existence since 1971. We started out as part of the Times newspaper, although we have been independent for many years now. And when we started off, we were an editorial magazine. But in 2004, we launched our first ever ranking, the World University Rankings. The World University Rankings looks at university excellence through the perspective of research. And it shares this with many other global rankings across the world. Most global rankings explore what it means to be a great research university. And of course, when you have a ranking like that, you typically have criteria for participation. In the case of the World University Rankings, we require that every university that participates has at least 1,000 publications over a 5-year period. That, of course, rules out many great institutions. And as we developed our rankings, we soon realized, of course, that research isn't the only mission that is critical for higher education. And so in 2015, we started to explore the teaching mission through a series of national teaching rankings. For example, the Japan University Ranking. These rankings tend to be country specific. But again, teaching is only one of the missions of higher education. And in 2018, we started exploring a very different perspective on what it might mean to be an excellent higher education institution. We started to explore what we would describe as the impact or the sustainability mission. In 2019, we launched the first ever Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, the only global rankings with a focus explicitly on the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A rankings that is open to every higher education institution in the world, and like all of our other rankings, participation is free to your universities. But why did we decide that the Sustainable Development Goals were the right framework to assess universities' commitment to sustainability? Well, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were created in 2015 as part of Agenda 2030. They replaced the Millennial Development Goals. And the idea was to create 17 discrete goals, each of which was a roadmap which demonstrated the steps that needed to be taken by nations, by organizations, and by individuals if the world was to avoid climate catastrophe by 2030. Within the 17 goals, the United Nations initially created 169 targets and 223 indicators, although those numbers have changed since then because the United Nations does occasionally adjust the targets and the indicators. The goals have been adopted by over 190 countries around the world. They are the major framework for understanding sustainability. But if they're to be successful, or as successful as they can be, they need organizations to participate and to commit themselves to a number of different things. The first of those, of course, is a commitment to the goals and their ideals of sustainability. The second is a willingness to develop and adopt partnerships across sectors and across nations. They require us to understand the importance of equity across the world. We can't have a situation where wealthier nations put all of the responsibility on to poorer nations, for example. We must recognize the disparities that exist. We need sustainability to be adopted in every community. And critically, we need to ensure that sufficient resources are put into delivering the goals. Finally, of course, sustainability requires long-term thinking. Now, I think universities are particularly well suited to drive the goals forward. There are a number of key reasons for this. Firstly, universities are located everywhere around the world. There are more than 35,000 higher education institutions. And these are often significant economic players within their towns and cities. Often a university will be the major employer, for example, in a city or in an area. Universities also have unique features, and one of them is the ability to think long-term. Most private companies have to focus on the next 3 months or the next year, whenever they next need to report their financial figures. Most politicians, and I speak here as an ex-politician myself, most politicians think to the next election, because if, as a politician, you don't think to the next election, you often stop becoming a politician. But universities think in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, and longer cycles. They inherently think long term. This makes universities particularly well suited for delivering the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why should your institution participate? Firstly, participation in our rankings is always free. We will not charge your university to be in our rankings. We have to acknowledge that, of course, there is a cost to you in terms of providing the data, but there is no financial cost that you have to pay to us. When you join the rankings, you can submit data to as many sustainable development goals as you like. You can participate in only one SDG, and that will get you into the rankings. By doing this, you will be joining a growing number of universities and institutions around the world, committing themselves to sustainability and committing themselves to demonstrate the work that they are doing, recognizing the fantastic efforts that are already being undertaken in your institutions. By using the data that comes out of our rankings, you will be able to benchmark yourselves and understand both where you are excelling and where there are opportunities to improve. And of course, as with all rankings, it will give your institution well-deserved visibility. We would encourage every university to consider participating in the rankings. You can go online. If you follow the QR code, you will be taken to a landing page where you can register your interest. but you aren't committed until the very end of the process. You can even put data into our data collection portal, but until you get to the end and press submit, you're not committing your university to anything. Now, when it comes to why universities should participate, we had this brilliant comment from Professor Claire Pollock from Western Sydney University when she collected the award for coming top of the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings in 2022. And she said, yes, we do educate. Yes, we do research. But if we are not making an impact and making a difference, then we are not fulfilling the goal of our existence. It's something that our communities desperately need us to do. It's something our governments expect us to do. It's something that our staff want us to do, and it's something that our students demand us to do. And I think this awareness of the demands that are being placed on university from different sectors of society is critical to understanding why sustainability and why the SDGs are such an opportunity for universities. Now, I mentioned the importance of equity in delivering the goals, and we're delighted to say that when we look at the impact rankings, the top performing universities are not all the usual suspects. They are not all the big Ivy League institutions from the United States or the Oxbridges from the UK. But actually, the impact rankings are starting to recognize universities around the world for the work that they are doing. And that is absolutely part of our goal with these rankings. We need to make sure that we are recognizing excellence wherever it is in the world. And excellence that is less tied to financial security and financial income and more tied to the impact that universities are having. So then, if that's our goal, if those are some of the framing questions, how do we go about assessing impact and understanding what it is that universities are doing to address the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, as you might imagine, it's not a straightforward task. Here we can see the targets that the United Nations created for SDG 4 quality education. And we might expect that because the SDG itself is labeled quality education, that all of these goals and all of these targets are immediately relevant to universities. And yet when we look at this, we can see that many of the targets are nothing to do with universities at all. And in fact, universities are only mentioned once by name in target 4.3. So how is it that we can take these targets and these indicators that were designed for all of society and identify the ways that universities can support them? Because I believe firmly that universities can support all of the targets and all of the indicators. Well, to help us to do that, we worked together with our partners, Vertigo Ventures, to establish a series of measures that we believe universities around the world would be able to respond to, would be able to provide data for, that related back to those targets. And to help us to do that, we created a theory of change. And the theory of change simply is a mental framework for understanding how you go from a set of objectives through to a set of outputs. And our theory of change has 4 key elements. So 4 key ways that we believe universities can have a direct effect on delivering the SDGs. The first of these is through the research that your institutions do. If you are doing research into battery technology, then clearly that can have an impact on SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, and also on SDG 13, climate action. And we can imagine going through all of the SDGs and exploring the ways that research can relate to the objectives. The second aspect of our theory of change is something that we describe as stewardship. Now, this is the part of the sustainability agenda that has traditionally been thought of. So this is about how your university looks after the land it's built on, the rivers and streams that might flow through it, the ocean it's next to, the woods, the forest, the land around it. But it's also about how you look after and safeguard the people who work in and around your university, and also, of course, your students. So it has that human as well as that physical element. The third aspect of the theory of change is to look at the outreach that your institution does. Although sometimes there is this image of universities as being ivory towers, is a phrase we often hear in the United Kingdom, this idea that they are separate from society. We know that that has never been the case. Universities are frequently community leaders, but this outreach work is rarely recognized, particularly in rankings. So we believe this is another aspect in the theory of change which allows us to demonstrate the work that universities are doing. And finally, of course, we have teaching. And to my mind, teaching has two key roles to play here. Firstly, of course, there is the need to develop relevant green skills for specific industries in the future, something that our governments are very keen on. But perhaps more important is the idea of ensuring that everyone who leaves university takes with them an understanding of what it means to be a sustainable citizen in whatever role they may have in the future, whether their role is as an educator in a university, whether it's as a politician or a business leader, or whether their role is simply being part of a family, being part of a community. All of our graduates should understand what it means to be a sustainable citizen. So we've taken this theory of change, we've looked at all of the targets in all of the SDGs, and we've tried to understand, using these 4 different areas, how those targets could relate to work that a university is doing. And it's not always divided equally into 25% chunks. It depends on the targets that the United Nations has created. Now, I mentioned equity earlier, and it's important that when we think about building out the ranking, that we do so in a way that is as fair and equitable as possible. One of the first questions we had was how to be fair to universities that may have fewer resources to provide data. And so we decided that as well as having the individual SDGs, each of which is a standalone ranking, we wanted to have an overall ranking, an overall understanding of the way that universities contributed towards the SDGs. Now, if we had asked universities to provide data for all 17 SDGs, we would have placed an unfair burden on institutions that had fewer resources. Instead, we decided that to be in the overall ranking, universities must provide data for SDG 17, plus at least 3 other SDGs. Interestingly, that not only made it easier for universities to participate, it also meant that we got to understand how universities in different parts of the world were focusing their efforts. For example, in India, universities are more likely to supply data for SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, and SDG 7, which is clean and affordable energy. If we look at Europe in contrast, the SDGs which are most overrepresented are SDG 16, peace, justice and strong institutions, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. So we see through this approach that actually universities are focusing on the things that matter most to them in their contexts. Now, of course, I should emphasize that to be in the rankings, you do not need to be in the overall ranking. You can provide data for just SDG 15, for example. But if you do want to be in the overall ranking, please provide data for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, and at least 3 others. Now, we also had to think very carefully about the metrics we chose. We had to make sure these were metrics that we believe that universities across the world had a realistic opportunity to provide data for. And we had to decide on how to choose metrics which were, wherever possible, reflective of the need of nations rather than necessarily the wealth of nations. One good example of this, a metric that we use in several SDGs, is looking at the proportion of your students who are the first person in their immediate family to attend a higher education institution, sometimes known as first-generation students. Now, this is a really interesting measure that allows us to understand to what degree is your university reaching out beyond the usual suspects in terms of people who attend university. And of course, it is easier for universities in countries which have not had a unified or massified higher education system to find first-generation students. If you're in a country if you're, for example, in the United States of America or in Western Europe, where traditionally many people have gone to university, there are fewer first-generation students that you could potentially attract. So it's an example of a metric which is biased against wealth and against more developed nations. Also, whilst we were building out the metrics, and this is something that goes on to this day, we had to listen very carefully to feedback from universities around the world, and we continue to do that. We have an advisory board that supports us in exploring how to develop the metrics, and we will be expanding that advisory board this year. It's also critical to us to listen to your feedback and your guidance. If you tell us that a question doesn't make sense for you in your context, then we want to hear that. We want to understand how we can improve those questions and how we can improve the guidance that we give you. Now, one challenge we have with the targets is that sometimes the targets the United Nations has set are not easily answered with numeric data. And here I'm showing you 3 examples from SDG 3, good health and well-being. Target 3.7 in SDG 3 looks at universal access to sexual and reproductive care. Target 3.4 looks at reducing mortality from non-communicable diseases and promoting mental health. And Target 3.A looks at implementing the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. None of these, on the face of it, are amenable to being answered with a number. So instead, we ask a question. We say, do you do something? And if you say yes, we ask you to provide evidence of the work you do. For example, for Target 3.7, we ask, do you provide free sexual health care and advice for your students? For Target 3.4, we ask, do you have free mental health support for staff and students? And for Target 3.8, we don't expect you to implement the entire World Health Organization Framework Convention, but we do ask if you have a non-smoking campus. So this is typical of the way that we address some of the targets, and I will explain the scoring mechanism in a few slides' time. One aspect of data that we don't require you to provide, though, is data on the research you're doing, because here we take our data from Elsevier's Scopus database. Scopus has publications from over 5,000 different publishers and has over 13 million publications in it. They have gone through all of those articles, all of those papers and conference proceedings, and have run queries to determine which SDGs, if any, those papers relate to. And of course, a paper can relate to more than one SDG at a time. And so we can use this core data set to interpret the work that your university has been doing in research. And again, just to emphasize, for the research elements, you do not need to provide any data. We gather that data automatically. Now, I mentioned that we create an overall ranking. How do we do that? Well, each year we create an annual score, which is generated by taking the score for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. We use that as an underpinning consistent SDG, and that is worth 22% of your annual score. And then we identify the 3 other SDGs in which your university performs most strongly. And we take the scores for each of those SDGs, and they are each worth 26% of the overall score. So that gives us an annual score. To create the overall ranking score, and this is something that we introduced as a change last year, to create the overall ranking score, we take the annual score from 2022 and we average that with the annual score from 2023. We decided to make this change last year to make the year-on-year changes smoother and to reduce some of the annual volatility we were seeing. It's worth noting that the SDGs that are strongest in each year may differ. Now, if a university is new to the ranking, we only use the score from the most recent year. So we don't divide that by 2, we don't average it with 0, we just use that score. However, if a university was in the ranking last year but does not provide data this year, then they will not be in the ranking this year. It's worth noting that this averaging approach only applies to the overall ranking, not to the ranking of the individual sustainable development goals. Now let's look briefly at some of the overview figures from 2023, and after that let's explore how your university can actively participate. Now the first thing to say about the participation from last year is that it continues a trend of growth. When we launched the rankings in 2019, only 540 universities were brave enough to participate in this great adventure. Since then, the ranking has grown to 1,705 universities that provide data for at least one SDG. And across every region, we've seen growth, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, and that's largely because pretty much every university is already participating. But we expect growth to continue, and we want growth to continue. We believe that the rankings provide a fantastic opportunity both to showcase the work you're doing, but also to get visibility on the world stage. And that global aspect is really important to us. The impact rankings are less biased towards wealth than most traditional rankings. It would be wrong to say that we have solved all of the problems of equity in the ranking, but we still believe that this is a much fairer representation of the excellence in global higher education than some of the traditional ranking approaches are. It's really pleasing to see, by the way, that out of our top 100 universities, we have universities from Africa, universities from Latin America, universities from Asia participating and getting into the top 100 in numbers that we simply don't see in other ranking systems. And we can see from the map here that we are significantly increasing participation. We still have work to do, particularly in Africa, in terms of convincing and demonstrating to African universities that this is something that is valuable, but that is something that we are committed to working on. Last year, 1,705 universities from 115 countries and regions participated. Now, to give you some context there, the World University Rankings, which remember have been in existence for 20 years, have just reached 1,900 universities. So my challenge to you is help us to overtake the World Rankings with the Impact Rankings this year. Okay, so that was looking at the framework for the rankings. How can your university participate, and what does best practice look like? Now, the first thing I'd like to say about this is we try with the impact rankings to be as open as possible about how we are going to calculate the score. The methodology document that we provide is available in multiple languages and is over 100 pages long. We go into extensive detail into what the data we need is. There are examples, there are frequently asked questions there. And the good news is that there are almost no changes from last year. The only major change is to the year that we're asking for your data for. So in every ranking, we want to look at a particular point in time, and of course that point in time changes as the years go by. Now, although we have multiple language copies of the ranking, when it comes to making decisions, we use the English language version as the master copy. So that's the one we always go back to in terms of if there are queries about what a particular question is trying to ask. Now, I mentioned that we look for data from a particular year, and we do recognize that for universities in particular, the concept of a year may differ. So sometimes a year might be an academic year, it may be a calendar year, it may be based on other things like a financial year. And we do allow some flexibility in this. And there's a guidance within the document about how to choose the correct definition of year that is best suited to your particular institution. But typically what we see is either the calendar year, the academic year, or the financial year is the one that you will choose. You can use the most appropriate annual cycle that best fits your data. That's a decision for you, but it should end in 2022. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the research data. Just to remind you, you do not need to provide this. This is provided to us directly by Elsevier. The queries that they use to identify the publications for each SDG are remaining the same this year as they were last year. And essentially the way that they do this is they have a series of complex queries for each SDG, and that identifies a core set of documents. They then use machine learning, or as we're now informed, we have to call it artificial intelligence, to identify any additional publications or articles that have been missed by the core queries. I have on my team a number of people like myself who started out life in machine learning, and we have evaluated the process that Elsevier use, and we think it's a pretty solid process, so we're very happy with that. Now, once we have these data sets of the articles, we can link those back to your universities, and we can then overlay specific metrics on top of those. For example, the number of publications from your university relevant to SDG 3. We also try and balance the numbers with some quality measures. Wherever possible, we try and make these a little different than the kind of metrics you would normally see in research-focused rankings. We try and balance these towards action rather than simple theory. For example, in SDG 3, we look at the number of times your research is cited in clinical frameworks. So is your research actively being used to drive best practice? Now, although we collect this data directly from Elsevier, there are a few things you can do to ensure that your university is as accurately represented as possible. The first is to make sure that your university is correctly identified in Scopus. You're able to do this on the Scopus website, even if you are not a client of Elsevier. So even if you don't have a Scopus license, there are mechanisms that allow you to check that your university is correctly identified. You can also, of course, explore the queries themselves. The queries that Elsevier uses are described in a publication on Mendeley. You can download those queries. It's even possible to run them against other bibliometric databases. We know because we've actually tried that. And the final thing you can do to support your research here is to encourage your researchers to make any relevance to the SDGs clear in their abstracts. So that could be by explicitly referring to the SDGs. It could be by using relevant terminology and making clear that that terminology is part of the article. But that, of course, will support and help to ensure that that research is appropriately picked up. But for the other data, how do you get that to us? Now, again, a reminder that this process is entirely free. When you register your interest in being in the impact rankings, we will create a password and a username for you. You will then be able to come to our data collection portal. And when that is open, it opens on the 18th of September and it closes on the 10th of November. So in that period, you will be able to enter data. So The first step of that, of course, is nominating someone who is responsible for providing that data, and then you simply log in. We will be sharing a separate video, which is a step-by-step guide through the data collection portal. But a couple of key things about it. Firstly, when you do log in there, we ask you to provide some information about your university, making sure we've got your name correct, and also describing what we would call the perimeter of your university. Now, that simply means the parts of your university that you are including in your data submission. For some universities, this is very straightforward and it's all of the university. For other institutions that have more complex structures, perhaps you're a federal university or you have many independent campuses, this might be about defining the campus or the part of the federal university that is relevant to this data submission. Now, you then have the opportunity to provide data for each of the SDGs you are interested in. Each is given a separate tab and you can go through and you can answer the questions. There is support throughout this process, so if you have any queries about the questions, if you're not certain what a question is asking for, you are recommended and encouraged to reach out to us and we will try and give you guidance for that. But until you get to the end of the process, you can enter as much data as you like, but until you get to the end of the process, where there is an opportunity to review the data you have provided and then press submit, until that point, you are not committed to being in the rankings. So you have complete independence to withdraw at any point until you press that submit button. So you've provided some data. Some of that data is going to be in the mode of evidence. Remember I said that it was challenged we had with some types of target where a quantitative answer would not particularly help. So how is it that we assess the qualitative data you provide? Now, this is the framework. It's slightly more complex than this, but this gives you a good description or good understanding of the basic principles involved. So the first thing we will do is we'll ask you one or more questions about that particular target. So that could be as simple as saying, do you do this? It could be slightly more complex. We said, do you do A, B, C, or D? But we will always give you credit if you tell us you do something. We believe you're trying to tell us the truth. So if you say you do something, we're going to at least give you credit for that. We will then ask you to submit some evidence. And our team of assessors will look at that evidence and we will say, yes, that evidence answers the question, or we will say, no, that evidence doesn't answer the question. If it does, we'll give you 1 point. If it doesn't, we won't give you any points. There is a halfway house. If we think that your evidence partially answers the question, we may give you a half point back. But finally, we will give you an additional point if that evidence is public. Now, this is a really important aspect of this approach. What we're saying here is, firstly, can you give us greater confidence that you're genuinely doing something? But that's probably the least important part of it. The second reason we want your evidence to be public is because by making it public, you are holding yourselves accountable to your stakeholders. They can see what you're saying. It's out there, potentially on your website, for example, and you have to live up to that, or you have to face the consequences of not living up to that. For example, in SDG 11, one of the things we ask about is your library, is your university library open to members of the public? And often the evidence provided will be the opening hours of your library on your website. Now, if you tell people that your library is open at 9 o'clock on Monday and it isn't, I can guarantee you that there will be people knocking on the library door trying to get in. So by holding yourselves accountable, that's a really positive thing that you can do. The final reason why I believe that public evidence is so critically important is because, of course, it gives other universities the opportunity to learn from what you're doing. They can see the brilliant work that you've undertaken. They can learn from it. They can maybe even improve on it. And that is part of the partnership model that we absolutely believe in. Now, what kinds of evidence do we accept? Well, we accept up to 2 pieces of evidence for any question. We prefer these to be links back to a website because they're easy for us to evaluate. But you can upload documents as well. So you could upload a Word document, a PDF, or an image. We can't, however, at the moment accept uploads of audio or video files. Simply that would overload our system. Now, we say up to 2 pieces of evidence. Why might that be the case? Well, there are going to be some situations where the question can't be answered easily with a single piece of evidence. It may be that the way that your university has developed a policy, for example, is to split it across 2 different policies. So it may be that you need more than one piece of evidence to answer a question. Now, I've said that public evidence gets additional credit, but what do we mean by that? Well, it's worth saying, by the way, that you can indicate that a piece of evidence is public or private yourselves. And if you say that it's private, then obviously you won't get a point for it, but we also won't share that with anyone else. But the kind of evidence that we accept as public is obviously things that are open on your website, or alternatively documents that can be easily found online. So if it's a document on your website and it can be easily located, then that will be accepted. And also external websites. So if, for example, you have done a brilliant piece of community outreach and your local newspaper has reported on that, then that is a brilliant piece of evidence for the work that you are doing. Of course, sometimes evidence is confidential, and we respect that. You will still get a point for it, but you won't get the additional point for it being public. This could be documents with sensitive information. It could be a document like a Google Drive document or a website that is private or is restricted by password. Now, how do we evaluate this evidence? What is the process? Well, we examine the evidence that is provided. Every piece of evidence is looked at by a real person, not by a ChatGPT. We do look at the evidence. If you provide 2 pieces of evidence and we look at the first piece of evidence and we can give you full marks for it, we often won't go on and look at the second piece of evidence because we've already given you all the credit you can get. So generally speaking, we will look at the first piece you provide first, and then only if it doesn't fully answer the question will we look at the second. Now, alongside the evidence, we do give you the ability to provide comments. And these are, the idea of this is to allow you to illuminate the evidence you provide. They are not evidence in themselves. Good examples of this would be, for example, for some universities, all of their policies are in a single document. This is often the case, for example, in Spain, where typically you have a single document that represents all of the policies of a university. When you do provide that link to that document, it's very helpful if you can indicate which page a specific policy is on. It saves us a lot of time, and we will be very grateful if you do that. Where you have 2 pieces of evidence that are linked, then actually using the comments to identify and explain how they link together can be very helpful. And sometimes a piece of evidence will be an example, but where you do things more broadly. So to give you a concrete idea of what I mean, in SDG 17, we ask about integrating education on sustainability within the curriculum. We obviously don't expect you to provide the curricula for every single subject you teach. You may provide the curricula for one and then say, this is an example. This is from our architecture degree, but we use the same approach across all of our subjects. And then the final thing that we've seen that is, again, very helpful is when you are referring, when your evidence refers by name to a third-party organization where we may not understand what that organization is. For example, if that organization is an NGO, or it's part of the government, or it's separate from the university, it's sometimes helpful if in the comments you can clarify that. A couple of other rules about data submission. When you start to supply data, one of the things we ask you for is the currency that you are providing the financial data in, please. You can choose whichever currency you like, but you must use the same currency throughout the data submission. It will usually be your local currency. And when we ask for evidence in particular units of measurement, please use those units. This is something that is usually directed at our American friends who still cling to some interesting units of measurement that the rest of the world doesn't use. So please do use the units of measurement that we ask. We don't have an easy mechanism for identifying when you supply data in unusual units of measurement. So let's look at some concrete examples then of what evidence might look like and some ideas about specific best practices. So again, just to reiterate, when you're providing evidence, it does not need to cover all levels of a question. And again, to give you a concrete example, in SDG 5, gender equality, one of the questions we ask about is how you support women to progress through your university. And we give several examples of the types of support you might give. For example, you may give scholarships, you may have mentoring, you may have specific courses tailored to women to support their progress. Now, obviously, with only 2 pieces of evidence, you can't demonstrate all of those different types, and we don't expect you to. We expect you simply to show one good example that demonstrates that you are working towards that. So evidence does not need to cover all of the levels, but evidence does need to be obviously relevant to the year that we're asking about. So if you have an example of an outreach program, we need to be able to see that that outreach program is active in the relevant year. And a critical point on public evidence, we do expect this evidence to remain public until at least the next data collection period. Now, we are practical people. We understand that sometimes evidence gets moved for reasons outside of your control. For example, your web team have just designed a fantastic redesign of your entire university website, and so the evidence gets moved around. And if you let us know about that, we can take that into account. But broadly speaking, we expect, if you say this is your evidence, we expect that to be available until the next year. And if we find it is no longer available, we may come back to you and ask, why is that the case? So a few more key points about evidence. One of the most important ones is that we don't expect evidence that you provide to necessarily be in English. It would be rather bizarre if you were producing documents for your students, your staff, your local community, and they were not in the local language, whatever that might be. So here's an example of a piece of evidence supplied around SDG 6. This is from a Chinese university talking about the collaboration they do around clean water. So absolutely, evidence can be in your local language, and we have a team of validators who include people who can speak many languages and will be able to assess them. Sometimes we ask for information about policies. Now, please don't get too hung up on the word policy itself. Sometimes this might be called a set of rules or guidances. It might be a code of conduct, a code of ethics, or simply an official document that explains this is how the university works. But the key things here are that we want to understand that your university has a process for dealing with particular situations. Generally speaking, these should not simply be national laws. So even if your government has a law, for example, on gender pay equity, that by itself is not usually sufficient to answer the question, because the law gives a general framework. What we would expect to see in those circumstances is a demonstration of how your university implements that law within the institution. For example, when it comes to equal pay, what processes are there for someone to complain if they believe they are not being paid the same amount as men? What evidence do you have about the degree to which your pay levels are equal. So it's that kind of thing we expect to see, rather than simply saying it's the law. One other aspect of the of policies is that we do expect policies to have been either created or updated within a 5-year period. Now, your policy can have been created many, many years ago, but it is best practice to ensure that you review your policies regularly to make sure they are still fit for process. A great example would be going back to Target 3.A in SDG 3. If you remember, Target 3.A from many slides ago is about implementing the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And in our case, we said, well, actually, we want to see that you have a non-smoking campus. Now, you may say, well, the solution to that is we have a policy on non-smoking, and that policy will probably stay fairly consistent because you may have decided to go non-smoking in 1972. It would still be valid. But review is useful because in reviewing it, you might have noticed that it didn't say anything about vaping or e-cigarettes, something that's come in since the policy was created. The review allows you to check whether or not your policy is still up to date, is still relevant today. And here's an example of best practice. This is from La Trobe University in Australia. And here is their smoke-free policy. So they describe that the policy has background and process. They look at the scope of the policy and so on. So it's a great example of a public policy that can be used as evidence. Now, alongside policies, sometimes we ask for standards. For example, in SDG 12, we ask about building standards. Standards are a little bit different from policies because whereas a policy may be enforced all the time, of course, standards are only really relevant when you are doing something, in this case, either adapting or building a building. Now, in this case, what we ask is that the standards are in place before the time period we're looking at. One slight change to our guidance this year is around recycled waste. For recycled waste, and again, this is in SDG 12, we ask for the proportion of waste that you recycle every year. This year, we have decided to allow universities to include waste that is recycled by using it to generate energy. So if the waste is incinerated, then that will count as recycled waste rather than waste that goes to landfill. Of course, one of the things you do need to consider if you are incinerating your waste is the impact in terms of your commitment to carbon neutrality. So although this is a positive, we're not sending waste to landfill, it does have implications for you. Another thing that we look for, remember, is outreach. So what does good outreach look like? Well, it can be work you are doing by allowing the community to come into the university as well as by going directly out to the community. So it can be educational outreach communities, or it can be things like volunteering programs. And here again, looking at La Trobe University, we can see examples of lunchtime seminars where they are clearly saying these are opportunities for people to come into the university. And they clearly mention that these are open to everyone in the community. I'm going to look at some concrete examples here of work that universities are doing. And the first area I'm going to look at is around sustainability and reporting on progress against the SDGs, because we do ask for this in two places. Firstly, we ask for it in SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production. And we ask for it here because target 12.4 is one of those that we directly reproduce in the rankings methodology. Target 12.4 encourages organizations of all types to produce and publish sustainability reports. So in our measure 12.4, we ask about how your university publishes a sustainability report. And note that a sustainability report does not need to necessarily refer to the Sustainable Development Goals, although obviously it can. However, in SDG 17, particularly in question 17.3, we do explicitly ask about your progress on each of the SDGs independently, even if you're not providing data for them in the rankings themselves. Now, you can do this by having a single report that covers all SDGs or by having individual reports. Let me show you a few examples from different universities. So here I'm looking at our SDG impact dashboard. This is the benchmarking tool that we have that is accessible by all universities. And here I'm looking at 3 universities that I love deeply. I love all universities, by the way, but 3 that I love deeply. Amrita Vishwa Vidyapitham in India. I'm also looking at Western Sydney University that came top of the ranking last year. And I'm also looking at the University of Manchester. And if I scroll down to publication of the SDG reports, I'm just going to look here at SDG 1, no poverty. You can see here that each of the universities concerned has said, yep, we do have a report that covers this. Each of them has described whether it's an overall report or it is a specific report. And for each of these, we can link to the report itself. So if I look at Western Sydney's report, here I can see a report that puts the SDGs within the overall context of the university's strategy. And I think this is a great approach to take, forward there by Professor Glover, the president of the university. But they have a clear strategy that puts sustainability at the heart of what they're doing. And then they relate each of the SDGs to that strategy. An alternative approach is taken by the University of Manchester. Here their report, rather than having the strategy up front and then for each point in the strategy emphasizing the SDGs that are relevant, in the case of Manchester, they instead have a section for each SDG and they focus on the SDGs themselves. The final approach is the one taken by Amrita, and here you can see that Amrita have created a separate report for each of the SDGs. Now, each of these approaches is perfectly valid and relevant. They are just different approaches. I think there are strengths and opportunities in each of them. And they give you a variety of different ways that your university can showcase the brilliant work that they are doing. And in the slides, you'll see that we've looked at a number of those. Now, I'm going to very quickly look through 4 additional SDGs and highlight some of the evidence that we see as best practice there, and then we will open up for some questions. So do keep your questions going. We have 42 questions at the moment that are unanswered. Just to give you an indicator, yesterday we had over 100 questions. So in SDG 3, what do we look at? Well, we look at a number of things. Obviously, we look at the research that's being done by your universities. We look at the number of your graduates who leave with a degree or accreditation in a health-related subject area. And we look at internal and external collaborations that exist to drive forward positive health. And if you remember, again, back to those 3 targets, 3.7, 3.4, and 3.8, target 3.4 looked at non-communicable diseases and mental health. And here's an example of a great piece of evidence from RCSI, the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, about their approach to mental health. They have a mental health and well-being policy, and critically it puts a social worker-led student welfare process that provides confidential practical help. They also have that available for staff members as well, recognizing, and this is really key here, recognizing the particular demands of healthcare training and work on their students and their staff. So it's an excellent example of the work that they are doing in supporting strong and flexible mental health in their students and their staff. In SDG 4, quality education, we look at a slightly different range of aspects in the data. Again, we look at research on pedagogy. We look at the proportion of your graduates who have teaching qualifications that would enable them to teach at a primary school and early years level. This is one of the focuses on SDG 4. It doesn't focus so much on higher education, it absolutely focuses on early years and on lifelong learning. We look at the lifelong learning measures that your university has in place. We also look at the proportion of your students who are first generation students. So in essence, we are trying to understand the extent to which your university really is open to people from all backgrounds. And here's an example from a different university. So this is from Lingnan University in Hong Kong, one of the great universities of Hong Kong here. And their example of educational outreach is a really interesting one because it looks at a key factor in many populations around the world, which is the aging population, but seeks to support the links between primary school teachers and, primary schools, not primary school teachers, primary schools and the aging community by making this Geron Technology Lab linking schools to elders in the community. It's a fantastic, I think, approach, which is really, really innovative. In SDG 5, gender equality, I've already mentioned this indirectly, but this is one of the areas, again, where we look at a range of different measures. As always, we look at some research-focused measures. We look at the proportion of students who are both female and first-generation students. So are you not only opening access to your university to people who have not been at university before or whose families haven't, but also how many of those are women? We look at the processes you have in place to make sure that women can apply successfully to your institution, not just overall, but in subjects where traditionally they have been underrepresented. And you'll notice we have two further measures on that. What proportion of women, what are the proportion of your students who are women who receive degrees? And also what progress measures do you have in place to ensure that women can progress through your university successfully? It's no good getting women to come into your university if you don't give them the means to succeed. And finally, we look to see how far that success can go. What proportion of your senior academics are women? Now, again, let's look at one example of this, in this case from the University of Bologna in Italy. The evidence that they're providing here is a really interesting project. So it's looking at how you can ensure that women are progressing and getting into universities, but doing so in subjects where they are traditionally underrepresented. We can query whether the name makes sense, although I would say, as I am a typical nerd, I'm a data scientist, I am a classic nerd in that sense, so I don't take personal offense to this, but here you can clearly see that they are targeting women's access to subjects in information technology where they may not traditionally have had good representation. The final SDG that I'm going to look at is one of the most critical ones, SDG 13, climate action. Here again, we look at the research your university is doing. We look at the proportion of your energy that comes from low carbon sources. So that's a really important measure. It's one that hasn't always been easy to assess across the whole university because often we've seen purchasing decisions for energy have been made by individual departments, but here the focus is on how you can actually ensure that as much of that energy as possible comes from low carbon energy sources. Critically, we look at the work you do to educate both your own students and the wider community about the environment. And then the final part is looking at your commitment to becoming a carbon neutral university. And the example that I'm going to use here, I think, is a really, really great example of how universities can not just set targets for themselves, but actually responsibly assess and manage those targets over time. This is best practice that comes from Simon Fraser University on the west coast of Canada. And they have a commitment to carbon neutrality, but they also go beyond that in ensuring that they continue to assess their progress on an annual basis. They have their climate change accountability report, and they also do an inventory across both scopes 1, 2, and 3 of the greenhouse gas protocols. That's a really strong and positive commitment, one we are seeing increasingly being undertaken by universities across the world. There has recently been a fantastic framework on this produced explicitly for the higher education sector, coming out of the Platinum Jubilee Challenge in the UK, supported by EAUC, and I would strongly advocate you look that up if you don't have a good framework yourselves. Okay, so we're reaching the end of my presentation. A few more things about how we can support your university to provide data. Obviously, we have the methodology, that's very detailed. We also have a frequently asked questions page. But if the question that you have isn't dealt with in either of those documents, we strongly advocate that you contact us. You can reach out on impact@timeshighereducation.com. We love to get these questions because they help us to provide better guidance for universities generally. If you're having doubts about what we mean by a question, then you are probably not the only one. It is really, really useful for us to get that feedback. And we also view this as not so much as an exam type process, but as an assessment type process. We want you to be able to provide the best data that showcases your university in the best possible light. So please do reach out to us during the process for advice and guidance. Data submission opens on the 18th of September and will continue this year until the 10th of November. We recommend that you start entering your data as soon as you can and you don't leave it to the last minute, although I know in reality most of you will leave it to the last minute. With that, thank you so much for listening to me for over the last hour. As a final reminder here, participation for all universities is free. Please do follow the link in that QR code to the landing page if you are interested. I would personally love to see all of your universities and the work that you're doing reflected in the impact rankings in 2024. With that, thank you very much. And James, I see we have 58 questions. Let's see how many of those we can get through before the end today.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Duncan. And you're absolutely right. We have a bumper crop of questions to get through. So if I start with a straightforward one, and it asks...
I'm always nervous of the ones you say are straightforward ones.
Yes.
They're frequently deep and insightful.
It's true, it's very true. So the first one asks, thank you for the information. Is there an opportunity to opt out from the rankings once we start participating?
So there is up until the point where you press submit. So you can go into the data collection portal, you can add data in there. Once you get to the point where you press the submit button, and that is when you're committing yourselves to being in the rankings. There are exceptional circumstances when we will allow a university to withdraw, but they are usually more to do around a university that is closing than other reasons. So usually it's once you've pressed submit, that is when you're committed. But up to that point, you can absolutely withdraw at any point.
Okay, hopefully another straightforward question. Is there a timeline to consider if an institution wants to be included within the ranking?
So there are two important timelines to consider. The one is the actual data submission process. So as I said, that starts in September and goes through till November. But the other one is whether or not you have appropriate data for the year that we're looking at. And for that, I strongly recommend you look at the methodology and get a feel for the kinds of data that we're asking for and whether or not you have those available. Obviously, I would love your university to participate in next year's ranking, but if you feel you're not ready yet, do take the time to look through and start preparing for the subsequent year.
Okay, so the next question asks, for women's access schemes, disability access schemes, and the access to university underrepresented groups recruitment, are you looking for evidence of a published policy in place for each of these? Would other types of evidence base be acceptable, e.g. for a link to our disability supports webpage?
So where we're asking for a policy, what we're looking for is a clear university commitment. So particularly around access, then if it's about are you committed to equality of access, we'd expect that. It can be the same document, by the way. Often we will see universities that have one policy that covers many different types of access and rather than individual policies. But the key thing there is that you are actually committed to that. Now, obviously, then there are a series of related questions which look more at the practical support you give. So in the case of disability access, we do want to know, it's one thing to say we are committed to it. Do you actually provide accommodations for people with disabilities, for example, so that they can fully participate in the university life? So there can be two slightly different things there. But the key thing here is, even if it's not called a policy, if it's called guidelines, if it's called a set of rules, we want to understand that your university has an institutional commitment to addressing disadvantage.
Okay, next question asks, will the posting of the official Facebook page of the university be allowed as evidence?
Yes, social media posts are examples of evidence. Obviously, they need to be findable and they need to be public, but yes, a Facebook post can be used as evidence as long as it is accessible.
Okay.
Someone's going to ask about TikTok at some point, I'm sure.
Okay, next question asks, if my university submits to just one SDG, will I also be ranked on the overall level or just for that specific SDG?
In that case, you would only be ranked for that specific SDG. To be in the overall ranking, you would need to provide data for SDG 17 and at least 3 other SDGs.
Okay. The next question asks, do you have a recommendation on how to prepare for the first participation? Is there something like a roadmap on how to choose the SDGs for participation without collecting information on all the indicators of all the SDGs?
So my personal starting point, and of course, the answer to this is it depends on your university, but my personal recommendation would be to take one of two approaches. The first approach is to think through what the focus areas of your university are. What are the areas where your university has a particularly strong interest, and how does that relate to specific SDGs? For example, if you are an SDG that is on the coast of a country, you may have a key interest in SDG 14, life underwater. If you are based in a country like India that has a clear national focus on clean water, it might be SDG 6. So that strategic focus, I would say, is the good starting point. But related to that is the very practical one of where do you already have data? So if you look across the methodology and you say, well, for SDG 5, actually, the data that's being asked for is all data that I have readily available. That is also a good way of making that decision. I mean, we would be more than delighted if you supplied data just to one SDG in the first year. You don't need, I would say it's probably better to think about starting the process, getting the buy-in from members of your university. And our experience, by the way, is that actually you will get strong buy-in, but lots of people in your university will be very keen to participate and to showcase the work that they are doing. But getting that buy-in is important, and it may be that starting small is the right way for you. We hope in the long run, more and more universities will be able to provide data on more and more SDGs, and there does seem to be a trend of that. But start where it makes sense for you. So I hope that's been some useful insight. That's based on my personal suggestions. Obviously, every university is different.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, our university is not a big one. Will we be ranked against institutions of the same size, or is there no division according to our size?
So there isn't a specific division according to size, but we do see universities of all sizes performing well in the rankings. When it comes to things like the amount of income, for example, in SDG 9 from industry and infrastructure, we normalize that by the size of the university. So there is some accounting for size that is taking place in the rankings. Now, you do, however, raise an important question for the future, which is, as the ranking gets bigger and bigger, are there other ways we might want to break this down so universities are comparing themselves on a more like-for-like basis? We are considering that at the moment. That is something we will be taking to our advisory board. But another aspect of this, of course, is how universities choose to benchmark themselves. Within our benchmarking tool, you can choose which universities you want to compare yourself to directly. So that gives you a much finer control in terms of understanding your performance against similar institutions, whether they are in your country or in a different country.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, did any of the top universities in the impact rankings turn out to be any of the universities excluded from the World University Ranking for being too specialized or too teaching focused?
So I can't answer that directly because I simply don't know. I would need to look through the reason they were excluded. Most of the universities that don't get into the World University Rankings simply don't have enough publications. That's usually the reason why they don't get in. And you could argue that's teaching focus. We do, however, have many universities that participate in the impact rankings that don't feature in the World University Rankings. And it's absolutely the case that universities in the impact rankings can perform much more strongly in the impact rankings than they do in the World University Rankings if their focus is more around sustainability than research. So I think there is, it's an interesting question. I also think, by the way, that as we expand the impact rankings, and this is something that is a notable difference, because of the focus of the World University Rankings, there will probably never be more than about 3,000 universities that qualify for that ranking. All universities could participate in the impact ranking, so potentially we could have 35,000 or more universities. We don't actually know how many universities there are in the world, so it's a bit of an open-ended question. I mean, if I ever got to that stage, I would be overwhelmed, but still there is much more potential to expand the impact rankings than there is the World University Rankings. And that's a good thing, by the way.
Okay. Going on to the next question. Why does indicator 4.2.1, number of graduates who gained a qualification that entitled them to teach at primary school level, only address primary school teaching, not secondary or other types and levels of education?
This is a great question, and this goes back to the United Nations SDGs themselves, the targets that the UN has created. When the UN is looking at quality education, their biggest concern was undoubtedly around early years and primary school education. That's the foundational building stone on which all other educational systems sit. If people don't get a good primary education, then they will not be able to get secondary education, and they certainly won't be able to get through to higher education. So this is an example of a situation where we have taken our lead directly from the targets the United Nations has set. And there are others throughout the SDGs. A good example being SDG 5, gender equality, because the focus there is on progressing women, not on dealing with situations where men may be in a minority. So we take our clear guide from the United Nations SDGs. Now, it does give me an opportunity to talk very briefly about one of my favorite topics, which is about those targets. Agenda 2030, which is the core of the SDGs, is a time-limited program. It is designed to end in 2030. The Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon have both said that there are many targets that will not be achieved in that time. And so it is highly likely that the SDGs will continue beyond 2030 in some form or other. But the targets themselves are likely to be changed to reflect both where the targets in the current SDGs have been achieved and also to strengthen the ones where they haven't been achieved. And this is an area where I would love to get more people from higher education involved in defining what the new targets should be. Obviously, that's not within my role as part of Times Higher Education. That's just something I have a genuine desire to see. I believe that the sector can support a better set of targets beyond 2030, and we should absolutely find ways that we can convince our governments to involve higher education in the process of defining the new targets. So sorry for that slight divergence there.
Okay. The next question asks, who does THE see as the target audience for the ranking? I don't mean the target universities for inclusion. I mean, who does THE think will be referring to these rankings? Who is the target audience?
I think there are at least 3 target audiences here. So the first target audience is actually universities. It's universities who want to understand their own performance across the SDGs. So that's our first target audience. The second target audience are students. Increasingly, we are seeing that students, not all students, by the way, some students want to go to university simply to ensure they get good jobs. But increasingly, we are seeing students who, after all, are the people who are going to live with the consequences of climate change. We can see that students are saying, actually, I want to go to an institution. I want to attend an institution that is committed to sustainability. So students are the second audience. And then the third audience is governments. Remember, 192 governments have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And governments are increasingly realizing that they have to do more. We are working hard at Times Higher Education to encourage governments to see what a valuable resource they have in terms of higher education, to use that resource more effectively to support their own national ambitions. So for example, 2 weeks ago now, I was lucky enough to attend a side event at the G20 in India, where we launched a publication which explicitly talked about the progress that higher education institutions have made and 3 opportunities for improving the involvement of higher education and using higher education as a lever for moving governments forward on the SDGs. So we believe those are the 3 key audiences that we want to address with this. And we think that the rankings provide that framework. They're not perfect. I'm not claiming that for one moment, but they give us some insight into the brilliant work that higher education does around sustainability.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question is asking for a bit of clarity, and it asks, at the beginning of the presentation, Duncan said it was enough to participate in just one SDG. Now Duncan says SDG 17 and 3 others are the minimum. It's a bit confusing, which is the correct requirements.
So I will start by apologizing for confusing people. It wasn't meant to be confusing. This is one of the challenges of when someone like myself knows a subject really well. I often make things overly complex or confusing. So apologies for that. I will try and be clearer. So think of the impact rankings as being 17 individual rankings, 1 for each SDG, plus an overall ranking. So if your university wants to be in just one SDG, then that is sufficient to be included in one of those 17 rankings, 1 for each SDG. So to be clear, you may provide data just for SDG 3, in which case you will be ranked within SDG 3 and SDG 3 only. But if you want to be in the overall ranking, that's where you need to provide data for SDG 17, plus at least 3 other SDGs. Those other SDGs can be whichever other SDGs you like. So it could be, for example, SDG 17, SDG 3, SDG 6, and SDG 8. But that's the difference. So to be in the rankings at all, at least 1 SDG. To be in the overall rankings, at least SDG 17 and 3 others. I hope that's clearer, and apologies if it isn't.
Okay, thank you. Next question asks, if a university has participated a few years ago and are going to participate this year, will the average score be taken from the last submission? So I think that's referring to if a university has had a break for a few years.
The answer is no. We only use the last 2 years. So if you weren't in the ranking this year, but you are in next year, then we will just have next year's score. We won't look back 3 or 4 years to previous score. So think of it as a 2-year rolling average, essentially.
Okay. The next question asks, there is still a significant amount of ambiguity around why some evidence is marked generic or specific, even though it seems exactly the same as evidence submitted by other universities. In a similar vein, the ranking evidence still seems to prefer wealthy Northern Hemisphere institutions. When will the rankings themselves become more equitable, accountable, and transparent?
So we are working hard to ensure that our evaluation process is as consistent and as fair as possible. Every year we bring in a significant team. This year we expect it to be over 80 people who will be assessing that, and we are putting in place second level reviews as well, and we can review evidence against previous years. At the end of the day, we do have people making decisions. So there are always going to be circumstances, much as with referees in football, where there are decisions that people will disagree with. But we are trying to minimize those wherever possible. We also will be exploring and will continue to explore the ability to use AI to produce some insight into this as well, although our experiments there so far have not been entirely successful. But we're committed to that. We're committed to try and making this as fair as possible. In terms of equity, again, we try wherever possible to be fair and equitable. There are inevitably some things that are balanced towards wealth. We try wherever possible to minimize that, but that is one of the challenges we face in the world. For example, research. We know that research is expensive. It is easier, therefore, for universities in wealthier countries to be able to do research on topics. Part of the challenge of sustainability is to build the partnerships that enable universities in less wealthy countries to benefit from partnerships with universities in wealthier countries, so that the learnings from both sides can be developed in a more equitable fashion. In terms of accountability and transparency, we try and be accountable through our advisory board. As I said, we're expanding that. And the methodology, I believe, is the most transparent of any methodology that is out there. It is somewhere in the region of 140 pages. It is a large document. We're always looking to find ways of improving that, though, as time goes on.
Okay, thank you. Next question asks, does Elsevier map SkyVal research topics and clusters to SDGs?
It's an interesting question. I don't honestly know the answer because I don't play in SciVal that much. I know that that they have effectively tagged every single publication, whether that's a research paper, whether it's a review, a book chapter, or conference proceeding, against each of the SDGs. So I would imagine that you can link back through those to their research topics and to their clusters fairly straightforwardly. I also know, by the way, that you can take the queries they built and execute them on other bibliometric databases, because we have evaluated that and have managed to get that to work as an academic exercise. So there are some opportunities there to explore the data further if you have access to SciVal. It's also worth saying, by the way, that other bibliometric providers have done similar things. So, for example, Clarivate have done this. I know that in Dimensions, you can do this as well.
Okay, it's just noticed we're coming up to 10:30, so I've probably got time for a few more questions.
One more question, that'll be fine.
Well, one more question. Okay, it's the last question then. Wouldn't having researchers refer to some SDGs in their research will create bias towards those SDGs? The most quotable SDGs will get a huge boost, while others will be forgotten or dismissed.
So this is a really interesting question to end up with, because it speaks to some of the practical challenges around academia. So how can we ensure that research is well focused? How can we prevent gaming of assessments, whether it's through rankings or individual assessments? It's not a straightforward process, I've got to say that. It is something that is worth looking at. We can see, however, that already there is a significant bias in terms of where research, in terms of which SDGs research is being done in. And if you remember the charts I showed from Elsevier, which showed the number of publications that have been identified by each SDG, they show that SDG 3, good health and well-being, is by far the most dominant SDG in terms of research, and SDG 1, no poverty, is by far the smallest. And you might reasonably say, well, is that just a factor of Elsevier's methodology? I've seen the same chart from Clarivate, I've seen the same chart from other bibliometric providers, and essentially they show the same thing, although the numbers might be slightly different. It's the same overall pattern. Now, this was one of the key recommendations that I put into my G20 report, which is that we need to make sure that actually research is more evenly distributed across the SDGs. And that makes a lot of sense if we think about it. We can understand why SDG 3 has so much research done on it. Medicine is a subject area where there is a huge amount of research to general benefit. And it's also an area where there is lots of funding. SDG 1, no poverty, although you could argue that it is equally important in terms of health outcomes, after all, poverty underpins so many health inequalities, it's not an area that has nearly as much research money and funding focused on it. And so I think there is a role both for universities in terms of directing research, and also in terms, perhaps even more critically, in terms of funders, in terms of funding more research, so that research is more evenly distributed across the SDGs. I think that is a more pressing concern, I think, than the concern about people misrepresenting SDGs in their abstracts and in their publications, although I do accept that that is a real challenge. So I think the first thing to do is we need to direct more focus onto, I wouldn't say the less popular SDGs, but the SDGs where less research is focused at the moment. But with that, I think we have run out of time, and we do need to bring this presentation to a close. On behalf of Times Higher Education, can I thank you all for your attendance? It truly is appreciated. And once more, can I encourage you, if you think that the impact rankings may be relevant to your university, please do consider participating this year. It's been an honor to talk to you on behalf of us. Again, I should remind you, we will send out the slides and we will send out the recording. Any questions we haven't answered, I will endeavor to take away and answer them and get a written response back. But on behalf of Times Higher Education, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.